In this session, I'm going to teach you how to talk. Now that I've got the controversial statement out of the way, I will explain a little bit more. One of the common mistakes made during negotiations is that people talk too much and they talk about the wrong things. They don't focus the conversation in a correct way that actually progresses to negotiation. The purpose of this session is to give you an idea of some of the techniques used by professional negotiators in order to actually communicate during a negotiation. Before I start that, I just want to thank the people who've given me feedback on previous presentation slides. That's been really helpful, and I've made several changes. So welcome any feedback from anyone on the new format, new layout, and if they think it works for them. So let's get into this. So, conversation. Why would we have a conversation during a negotiation? And there's some obvious answers to this. Of course, if you're going to turn up to a meeting with someone, it is the social norm, it is the convention to be polite and friendly. And yes, that is what you should do in any normal professional environment. But I talk quite a bit in previous sessions about understanding what type of negotiation you're entering into. So let's pick a bit of a silly example. Let's imagine that you're a military person going to negotiate with the Taliban. Bit of a silly example. Do you necessarily wish to turn up to that negotiation appearing polite and friendly? The answer might be possibly not, because you might be in a very hostile stroke adversarial negotiation. Now, of course, you might be that you do want to ask them nicely for things, and so you should be polite and respectful. On the other hand, this might be an environment where you've decided that you actually want to intimidate the other side. And I don't ever endorse that in any business or professional negotiation. I'm just using the Taliban one as a silly example. But in that scenario, any military negotiator, for example, and I'm sure other law enforcement style negotiators will be familiar with these sorts of techniques, would very much seek to intimidate the other side. And you don't do that by talking or by being polite or friendly. You would see them deploy techniques that are very precise, very abrupt, and sometimes say nothing at all. And that in itself is its own form of intimidation. So those are the sort of things you might think about if you're doing a really hostile adversarial negotiation. But for the purpose of this session, let's not assume that. Let's think we are doing a professional business style collaborative negotiation. So in this scenario, you would enter a room, you would obviously greet people, you'd be polite, you'd have a small small chat, just a conversation with them. And you're doing that because you want to establish trust and a good relationship with those people. Obviously, you're going to be spending quite a bit of time with them, discussing things, and it's good to build that rapport with the other side. That's always what you do on a big collaborative style negotiation. You also want to make a good impression. You want them to think positively about you. If you don't make that good impression, that very much undermines your ability as a negotiator. So obviously, you will want them to see you as approachable, friendly, but also somebody who knows their subject matter, who knows their business. So you want to appear competent. And that's part of what you do when you enter into a room and start a conversation with people. That's important in negotiation. I always like to say there's no such thing as non-negotiation time. And that even includes meeting and greeting. It may not be direct negotiation time, but it's all part of the process of building trust, building relationship, making impressions. And you want to think about that before entering into it. You want to know what it is you want to do, how you want to go about it. Because really, what you're trying to also do is to establish everyone's credentials. So you'll be obviously yourself as a competent negotiator, but quite often these sorts of negotiation, people turn up in teams. So there'll be introductions. You want to know who is there, why they're there, what is their purpose in the negotiations, what are they there to do, what are their competencies. These are all important things. So ultimately, even in this meet and greet beginning conversation sort of thing, what you're doing is you're trying to gather information about the other side. And that is all information that consciously and subconsciously will be useful to you and to your team. Now, of course, the reverse is true. So as any lawyer will tell you, anything you say can be used against you. So you have to be conscious of this, that for you and for your team members, you are equally being scrutinized and measured by the other side. So again, you need to be thinking about what information you are giving them and how you're presenting it to them. But all this is a fairly casual conversation. What does this have to do with negotiation? Let's come to that. So when it comes to actually communicating during a negotiation, I always like to talk about process first. Let's start procedurally. Let's get the boring stuff out of the way. During a negotiation, it's back and forth. And what I mean by that is one side talks and then the other side talks. It could be scripted, not too scripted, hopefully. But it is not a dinner party type conversation. When you're actually in negotiation, there isn't a bubble of conversation of various people chatting. It is one person at a time, and then one person handing over to the other side to then say their piece. And this has become very obvious in more recent months, and with everyone having to negotiate via video conferencing remotely. You really have to do it that way. You can't talk over each other when video conferencing, because you just drown each other out. So, but actually a normal negotiation is like that as well. So you definitely do not talk over each other. That is just bad. If that starts to happen, that generally means that the negotiation is not going well, or that is you're losing control. So if there is any requirement for a parallel conversation, that should be held in a different room. So the process during negotiation is very much one side is talking and then the other side is talking. Now there's an element of stage management here, especially if you're operating as a team. So the lead negotiator may decide that they will respond to any particular topic raised, or they may decide that it is more appropriate for a team member with competence in that area, for example, to respond. So there's very much an element of stage managing. It's almost a stilted conversation in a way, but that is entirely normal during negotiation. It is entirely common for the lead negotiators to ask for a member of their team to take the lead and start the conversation on that point, and only to jump in when they feel it is necessary, or to progress to the next stage or to clarify. But I'll come on to that. So what a lot negotiation is really about is listening. And you're very closely listening to what each other are saying. This is why there can only ever be one conversation. If you have more than one conversation, you can't properly listen to that conversation. So it has to be one conversation at a time only. And that is very much the procedure for when conducting a big, especially complicated negotiation. Now there's certain categories of conversation when you're having a negotiation. There's only three, and it's really nice and simple. When you're actively negotiating with the other side, there's only three things or three types of things you should be saying. One, you could be setting out a position, and this is always done at the beginning of the negotiation side. Each side will set out what their opening position is, and a few details around that. The other category of conversation is clarifying. So a lot of negotiation time at the high level is actually spent asking questions. And that is because you will be asking the other side to clarify their position, to go into further detail on a particular matter, whether that be technical, financial, legal, for example. You will ask them to expand upon that point and to give you a bit more information. Because ultimately what you're trying to do is understand the position of the other side and understand why they have that position. And that's very important, because one of the common mistakes made during a negotiation is people rush too quickly to state their own position, and just to want to, get it off their chest, as it were. And that's always a mistake. So you should always be stage managed, and you should always allow the other side to set out their position, for you to set out your position, perhaps as an opening introductory thing, and then to start clarifying what it is, each other's position, and why. And the why is very important, because you need to understand the why if you are to make a decision on whether to accept or reject their proposals. So, in their position. And it's very common for people to hear a position and then to immediately reject it, because without actually clarifying what's behind that position. And that's a common mistake that's made. The other common mistake made, and as I said earlier, people talk too much. So anything said during a negotiation that doesn't fall into these three categories is not actually a negotiation. It's just a discussion. And it can be helpful, or it could be part of the process of gaining information, part of the process of you giving them information. But what it isn't is an actual negotiation. An actual negotiation conversation is only in these three categories: setting out a position or proposal, clarifying those positions or proposals, or accepting or rejecting it. That's it. That is all that happens in a proper negotiation. And professional negotiators, when they're doing two back and forth, will only talk to each other, essentially, in these three categories. And that's not because they don't have anything interesting to say, but that is because they know how to get to what it is they need to do as quickly as possible. This is why professional negotiators are so much faster than amateur negotiators. They don't waste time with all this extraneous discussion. Now, there is an exception to this rule, or these rules even, and that is what I call cultural differences. Certain cultures will not necessarily be comfortable with negotiating around the table. Others will be. And it's important to recognize that, because what that can mean is that essentially the negotiations could take place during the coffee or lunch break outside of that meeting room, if that is how that culture, that country, those people, how they operate. And this is another reason why I say there is no such thing as non-negotiation time. Even when you're having a conversation or a chat with someone, you can be effectively negotiating a position. And it's important to understand whether during that conversation you are doing one of these three things, one of these three negotiation categories. Because sometimes you can't. Sometimes it could be the junior people having a conversation. But what that means, that junior person can come back to the lead negotiator, say we've reached agreement, and then when you get back to the table, the lead negotiators effectively formally accept what it is those junior people negotiated around during the coffee break. And that's fine. That's a structured, organized way of doing it, and it's appropriate for certain cultures. So be aware of that. Things not to do during negotiation. The big one is justify. Now, justify is different from clarify. When you're trying to get someone to clarify something, you're trying to understand them better. When you're justifying, you're trying to defend something. So, as an example of that difference, let's imagine you've rejected someone else's proposal, and they say, "Oh, we think this is reasonable. Why have you rejected it?" Now, as your response is something on the lines of "we don't like it" or "we don't think it is fair," you're actually just justifying yourself. It's almost an emotive style of communication. Whereas a professional negotiator would say something more along the lines of, your proposal doesn't meet our requirements, which are essential for these reasons. And you can set them out. That is you clarifying why you have rejected that proposal, not justifying. And that's important in a negotiation. A lot of people get hung up and end up trying to justify their position. And that's a bit of a slippery slope that we can end up finding yourself, being pushed hard to explain why you've had that position. If you're trying to justify it, then you almost enter the emotional territory. So this is a key point. Don't get emotional. That is not what negotiations are about. Negotiations really are about trying to get to the facts of the matter, trying to identify what's important to both sides and to cut through those issues to get right to what's important, right what is necessary, and to establish where both sides can reach agreement. And that does not have to be an emotional process. So what is also important as part of that is that you don't just hear what you want to hear, what you think the other side has said. Communication errors or misunderstandings are incredibly easy during negotiations, especially if you're dealing internationally with people from other countries. So it is absolutely essential that you always check that you have understood what the other side has said, and that what they have said to you is what they intended, what they meant when they said it to you. And it's very easy to hear something to have a different interpretation on it. So this is something else that professional negotiators will do. They will always check that they have understood what the other side has said. And they may use certain techniques like summarizing at the end of each point and so on and so forth. That allows them to check that everybody has the same understanding. When they use the same words, they interpret, they mean the same thing with using their words. They have meant something else. Another thing to avoid is responding impulsively. And sometimes people do that. You can be surprised, you can hear something that you weren't expecting, and the instinct is to respond impulsively to that, possibly even rudely. And that should always be avoided. And the final thing in this section is try to avoid bluffing from a position of weakness. So what I mean by that is that we're talking collaborative, complicated negotiations. And quite often someone will ask you something that you do not have the answer to. And a common mistake to make is to try and give an answer that you had no opportunity to fully think through, you haven't prepared for, essentially to bluff your way out of it. And that's quite a common mistake. So I'd always advise in that sort of scenario that you say you'll need to think about it and you'll come back to them. And you can do that. You can go and speak within your team during break, for example. You could even call back to a particular expert that may be back in the office but not at negotiation. But the point here is what you don't do is essentially shoot from the hip during the negotiation. Remember the three categories. You're either accepting what people are saying or you're clarifying. And if you do it badly, then the propensity for misunderstandings or for them not to particularly like the answer, that increases. So try to be extremely precise in your responses. So I end this with a few professional tips, things that professional negotiators do, how they behave when they're communicating during negotiation. One is they talk less. Really simple. They are listening, giving the other side plenty of opportunity to talk, or perhaps plenty of rope to hang themselves with. Remember, the more information, the more you talk about, the more you give the other side. That may be a good thing, that may not be a good thing. but quite often professional negotiators will not be the one doing the most talking. A really well prepared negotiator will know everything they want to say before they even enter into the room. You almost have a little checklist of all the various points you want to make, all the various questions you want to ask. And of course you will have to be adaptable to respond to what the other side is saying. But as a good rule, if you're prepared really well, you're already known to a certain degree how that conversation, that negotiation is going to go. It's also important to be patient and to always hear the other side out. And this again is a bit of a common mistake. Negotiations are not necessarily a linear process. You don't work your way through everything in the most efficient, most logical pattern. And that is because sometimes people are having to think their way through a problem as well as negotiate. So that means the negotiation can end up being quite circular. So professional negotiators will understand this, and they will understand the need to be patient and to wait for the right time to put forward the question or the proposal for consideration by the other side. Timing is key, and quite common. People have a great idea and a great proposal, and it genuinely is a great idea and great proposal, but they push it forward too soon before the other side are ready to hear it. And so you end up having this sort of discussion that doesn't really go anywhere for quite a while before finally people sort of talk themselves out and get back to the main point, get back to what the facts of the matter actually are, and then consider that sort of proposal or a similar proposal more seriously. So what it kind of means as well for any professional negotiator, a little sort of rule I try to apply, that I try to make everything I say have a positive impact. And you do that by listening carefully, saying very little, because actually it's very hard to be impactful if you're talking a lot. The less you say, the more impactful you can be, because suddenly people will go, oh, he hasn't said much, what's he got to say? Where if they're a bit bored of hearing your voice, then they might switch off, perhaps. So the less you say, if you save yourself for the correct time, and it's all about timing as well. So you save yourself for the correct time with a good idea, and if you get that right, you say your piece, you don't say too much, you don't try to justify, you don't try to overdo it, you just lay it out clearly, coherently. The other side say, oh great idea, we'll accept that proposal. And then let's say 10, 20 minutes or an hour later, you do that again and again. And that really enhances your ability to be an effective negotiator, because people know that every time you say something, it's worth listening to. And that is perhaps one of the true secrets to how you can see a real professional negotiator behave. I hope all of that has been helpful to you and insightful, and look forward to preparing the next session later on.